the queen of summer society. The fog rolled in thick that morning, so heavy it clung to the spires of Newport's churches and softened the glow of the gas lamps until the streets looked like something pulled from a dream or a nightmare. By noon, the sea mist had swallowed even the grand silhouettes of the mansions along Bellevue Avenue, leaving only faint outlines of gables, turrets, and chimneys, like ghosts of wealth floating above the earth. At the Belmont Hotel, an opulent monument of white marble and gilded mirrors, maids whispered nervously in the corridors, because room 237, once the jewel suite of Newport's most famous socialite, had become a shrine of silence. The curtains were drawn tight. A single half-written letter sat abandoned on the desk. Two untouched glasses of champagne rested on a table beside a forgotten ruby brooch that glimmered faintly in the half-light. Isabella Fairmont was gone, and though Newport society would spend decades pretending to forget her, the truth was simple and terrifying. Isabella Fairmont did not vanish into the fog. She was erased, the gilded stage to understand how a woman like Isabella could command, and then lose, such extraordinary power. You must first picture Newport in 1881. Newport was no sleepy New England port town anymore. It was a stage, and every summer, America's richest dynasties descended like an invading army armed with money instead of muskets. Mansions bloomed along the cliffs like marble fortresses, cottages, they called them, though each could have housed an entire village. Italian gardens stretched toward the sea, fountains gushed and carriage wheels rattled over gravel drives while society reporters scribbled names into notebooks that would be devoured by the public the next morning. The Gilded Age was not subtle. It was a performance, a carnival of glittering excess, and Isabella Catherine Aldrich Fairmont was its brightest star. Born in 1859 to Cornelius Aldrich, a shipping magnate who turned the Atlantic into his private highway, and a mother whose family tree curled back into the soil of Puritan Massachusetts, Isabella had both the bloodline and the fortune to be untouchable. But it wasn't pedigree that made her unforgettable. It was presence. Witnesses described her entering a ballroom, like a flame catching in a draft. Raven black hair piled high, blue eyes sharp as glass, gowns tailored so perfectly the French couture houses swore she must be stealing their sketches before they reached Paris. When she laughed, men leaned in as though the sound itself might anoint them. Women studied her as carefully as scripture, imitating her gowns, her jewelry, her very way of tilting her head when she listened. By the time she married Theodore Fairmont in 1878, the heir to a steel fortune, her reign was secure. Together, they built Rosecliff Manor, a palace of 70 rooms, each dripping with imported marble and frescoes that scandalized the clergy with their decadence. There Isabella hosted dinners where senators clinked glasses with European dukes and where, it was whispered, fortunes were quietly made and unmade behind the laughter of chamber quartets. The Newport Daily News ran a weekly feature called Mrs. Fairmont's Week, chronicling her outfits, her guest lists, even her charitable causes. In an era when women were meant to fade politely into the shadow of their husbands, Isabella had become something rarer, a figure of influence. Politicians sought her approval, industrialists courted her counsel, and once even President Chester, Arthur sat at her table, glass in hand, visibly charmed. But in Newport, reputation was currency, and currency was fragile. A single rumor could collapse an empire. And as the fog of summer 1884 rolled in, so too did whispers that would eventually drag Isabella Fairmont into history's shadows. The season of shadows, it began with an architect, Jonathan Pembroke. He was young, strikingly handsome, and brought to Newport with credentials polished like marble. He had restored colonial estates in Virginia, designed Gothic revival castles for Pittsburgh barons, and carried himself with the weary magnetism of a man who had already lived 10 lives before. 30. His dark hair fell perpetually into his eyes, which were green and sharp enough to unsettle even Newport's most jaded matrons. He was danger disguised as elegance, and danger was precisely what Isabella craved. Their meeting was innocent enough. A committee gathering at Trinity Church to review proposed architectural renovations. Isabella, chairing the committee with her usual command, leaned over the table to inspect Pembroke's blueprints. Witnesses later described a strange silence in that moment, as though every person in the oak-paneled room sensed the current that snapped between them. Soon, Pembroke was a fixture at Rosecliff Manor. Officially, he was consulting on a planned expansion of the estate. Unofficially, he was a shadow in Isabella's study, a confidant in the garden, a name whispered through the corridors. Servants reported her laughter sounded different when he was present, looser, brighter, tinged with something they did not dare call happiness. By midsummer, the whispers had gathered momentum. By autumn, they were no longer whispers at all. The fall, October 12, 1884. The New York Herald ran a headline that struck Newport like a thunderclap: Newport's fallen angel. The column laid out Isabella's affair in meticulous, merciless detail. Meetings with Pembroke at his studio, secret letters, stolen embraces. But the scandalous revelation was not love, it was money. The article claimed Pembroke was drowning in gambling debts and Isabella had been funneling him small fortunes, even selling heirloom jewelry to cover his losses. For Theodore Fairmont, the betrayal was twofold. His wife had not only been unfaithful, she had been deceived, humiliated, turned into a benefactress for a swindler. In the libraries of Rosecliff Manor, in the spaces where deals were forged and reputations preserved, Theodore confronted Isabella. The argument, servants whispered, lasted hours, shouts, slamming doors, a woman's voice declaring love like a curse. When Isabella emerged, she was changed, defiant, reckless. She refused Theodore's ultimatum to end the affair, to submit to exile, to bow before society's judgment. She would not yield. But defiance, in Newport, was suicide. Invitations dried up, friends cooled. Even the newspapers that had once adored her shifted tone, painting her as tragic, unstable, already half banished. What none of them knew, what even Theodore did not yet suspect, was that Isabella held a weapon more dangerous than scandal. A weapon that, once revealed, would sign her death warrant. Secrets in the Walls, late November of 1884. Isabella summoned representatives of Newport's most powerful families to a private dining room at the Belmont Hotel. Senators, railroad tycoons, shipping magnates, all men who had built their legacies on foundations of granite and gold. There, she delivered her ultimatum. Through her relationship with Pembroke, she had learned of hidden rooms, false walls, and secret vaults concealed in Newport mansions, and inside those compartments, she claimed, lay the proof of crimes that could ruin dynasties: forged contracts, bribery ledgers, evidence of price-fixing schemes that had siphoned fortunes from government coffers. She threatened exposure. Unless, of course, they granted her freedom, money, safe passage to Europe, a future with Pembroke. The meeting stretched into the night. When it ended, Isabella had what she believed was victory, a promise of funds, a ticket to reinvention. But those she threatened were not in the habit of yielding to women, or to anyone. And so, as she retired that evening to her hotel suite, scribbling letters and posing for strange, haunting photographs, the countdown began. The final week, December 1st, 1889, Isabella spent the day visiting places of significance: the church where she had wed, the cliff walk where she had once dazzled European nobles, the casino where whispers of her affair had first been born. Witnesses recalled she lingered at each site as though saying goodbye. That night she dressed in blue silk, pinned her grandmother's ruby brooch to her chest, and descended the Belmont Hotel staircase with a small valise in hand. The clerk remembered her smile. He remembered the fog swallowing her as she stepped into the street. She was never seen alive again. When police searched her room the next morning, they found her letters unfinished, her jewelry scattered, her champagne glasses untouched. But in the fireplace, half burned, lay scraps of paper, calculations, names, and initials that would mean nothing to the casual eye. To Detective Samuel Harrison, they meant everything. One name stood out among the ashes: W. Blackstone. A senator. A kingmaker. a man whose fortune was said to be unshakable. And that was when Detective Harrison realized something chilling. Isabella Fairmont had not disappeared into the fog. She had stepped into a trap designed by America's most powerful men, and she had never stepped out. The architect's secret. The day after Isabella Fairmont vanished, Newport society did what it always did when scandal knocked on its door. It smiled politely, pulled the drapes, and whispered in hushed tones over tea. But behind the mahogany doors of Newport's private clubs, men were not whispering. They were panicking, because Isabella had not merely threatened reputations, she had threatened to dismantle dynasties. Detective Samuel Harrison understood this almost immediately. His first clue was not the champagne glasses in her room, or the burned fragments in the fireplace. It was silence. The silence of servants who suddenly forgot what they had seen. The silence of hoteliers who misremembered details they had offered freely the day before. The silence of Theodore Fairmont himself, who, when questioned by police, wore the hollow look of a man grieving, but grieving something far larger than a wife. It was the silence of power closing ranks, the phantom of Jonathan Pembroke. To find Isabella, Harrison first had to trace the man who had ignited her downfall, Jonathan Pembroke. On paper, Pembroke was brilliant. His blueprints, stamped with an architect's seal, revealed an eye for beauty and an obsession with precision. But Harrison noticed something odd as he examined the records of Pembroke's Newport commissions. Each project contained additions that did not appear on the official plans filed with the city. Hidden staircases, false walls, hollowed-out fireplaces. When Harrison asked a city building inspector about them, the man shifted uneasily and confessed that Pembroke had been known for eccentric requests at the insistence of his wealthy patrons. But the inspector added one detail that chilled Harrison to the bone. Every one of these eccentricities was built in spaces designed to keep secrets, not just valuables. When Harrison followed the trail to Boston, he discovered Pembroke was no longer a phantom. He was a corpse, found dead in a boarding house the very day before Isabella disappeared. The official cause, heart failure, but the boarding house keeper whispered a different tale. Two well-dressed men had visited Pembroke that afternoon. They had carried no luggage, left no names, and walked with the calm assurance of men who knew no one would dare ask questions. Hours later, Pembroke was found cold in his bed, his face contorted not in peace but in horror. For Harrison, the puzzle sharpened. If Isabella had been planning to escape with Pembroke, she had walked straight into a trap, one where her lover had already been silenced. The ghost map of Newport determined. To understand Pembroke's hidden architecture, Harrison returned to Newport with a stack of stolen blueprints. He studied them late into the night, candlelight flickering across vellum sheets that seemed almost to breathe. Rosecliff Manor, the Vanderbilt estate, the Peaton Mansion. Each bore Pembroke's flourishes. But when Harrison overlaid the plans against the city's official maps, the pattern emerged. Secret chambers were not scattered randomly. They formed a network, hidden vaults connected by narrow passages, concealed cellars that could be accessed only by those who knew where to press against the paneling. It was as though Pembroke had been commissioned to build an underground skeleton beneath Newport's glittering body, and what skeletons it held. Harrison theorized Isabella's knowledge of these vaults was real, not drunken fantasy. She may have held documents, or worse, she may have hidden them, knowing she was being hunted. But where? The answer came from an unlikely source, an elderly seamstress named Margaret Winthrop, who claimed to have seen Isabella on the night she vanished. Mrs. Winthrop's account was riddled with gossip, half-truths, and nervous rambling. Yet one detail stood out. She described Isabella wearing her grandmother's ruby brooch, its crimson gleam catching the moonlight as she was escorted into a carriage with two strange men. Her destination, Winthrop swore, had been the courtyard of the Peaton Mansion. The house on the cliffs, the Peaton Mansion, was one of Newport's crown jewels, a towering estate of granite and glass perched high above the cliff walk. Its owner, Charles Peaton, was a railroad magnate with a reputation for ruthless efficiency in business and in politics. His parties rivaled Isabella's for opulence, though his invitations leaned more toward senators than artists. But rumors about the mansion had circulated for years. That guests sometimes disappeared into the wine cellars and did not re-emerge for hours. That Peyton had imported European craftsmen specifically to create curiosities in the basement, details never included in public tours. Harrison arrived at the gates in early January 1890, snow crunching beneath his boots, the ironwork glistening with frost. He carried a warrant, an unusual triumph considering how quickly every other official door had slammed shut in his face. The servants at Peyton's estate tried to stall him, but Harrison pressed forward, his lantern casting jagged shadows across marble floors and tapestries of hunting scenes that seemed to leer. When he descended into the wine cellar, the air grew colder, thicker, as though the walls themselves exhaled secrets. His building inspector confirmed it. The measurements were wrong. The cellar's official dimensions left an impossible gap, 8 feet of missing space. Stone by stone, they pried open a false wall, the sound of crowbars and picks echoing through the chamber like muffled screams. Dust billowed out, choking, acrid, and then behind the wall they found the door, iron, lead-lined, without a handle. A room built not for storing wine, a room built to contain. The inspector's crowbar scraped along the edge of the sealed door, searching for leverage. Harrison pressed his lantern closer, squinting at the seam, and there, etched faintly into the stone, he saw something that made his stomach knot. Scratch marks, long, frantic, human scratch marks. They trailed downward in jagged lines, as if someone had clawed at the wall with desperate hands, trying to escape the room beyond. And Harrison knew, before the chamber even opened, that he had found Isabella Fairmont. But what he didn't yet know, what would haunt him for the rest of his life, was that Isabella's story did not end with her body. It ended with the secrets buried beside her. The chamber beneath the cellar. The false wall gave way just before dawn. The sound of stone splitting and crumbling into the dark was strangely muffled, as though the air behind it had not been disturbed in centuries. When the final slab fell, the investigators froze, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt. The air that poured from the chamber was heavy, stale, sour with the scent of damp fabric and something sweeter, almost cloying. It wasn't decay exactly. It was older, stranger, like perfume left too long in a sealed bottle. Detective. Harrison raised his lantern. Its flame sputtered as if reluctant to enter. The light revealed a narrow room, its walls lined with lead sheeting, dull and gray. And in the far corner, crumpled like a marionette abandoned mid-performance, lay the silk-wrapped form of Isabella Fairmont. The ruby brooch still glinted at her chest. For a long time, no one moved. The woman who would not yield Isabella's body was astonishingly intact. 2 months underground, yet her features had not collapsed into ruin. Her lips were pale, her hair still neatly coiled as though awaiting another ballroom. But her hands told a different story. The nails were torn, the skin ragged, the fingers curled in the shape of frantic resistance. On the lead walls around her, the scratches were unmistakable. Vertical gouges where she had clawed, over and over until her strength gave out. The coroner whispered that she had been poisoned with chloral hydrate, likely slipped into champagne. Enough to weaken, not to kill immediately. A cruel trick. She had been buried alive. And in her final moments, Isabella had tried to write. A half-shredded scrap of paper clung to her hand, nearly illegible, but the faint impression of letters remained. W.B. Senator William Blackstone. The House of Echoes. Harrison ordered the room cleared, but even as the others left, he could not bring himself to turn away. The chamber unsettled him not because of the body, but because of its design. The walls were perfectly smooth, soundproof. The ceiling arched slightly inward, as though designed to focus sound toward the floor. A chamber built to silence, but also to listen. He pressed his ear against the lead. For a moment he swore he heard something, a faint rhythm, like footsteps echoing through stone. He jerked back, lantern shaking. Later, when he asked the inspector about the structure, the man muttered a phrase that made Harrison's blood run cold. "These aren't hiding places. They're holding cells." How many others had been locked? Inside? How many other secrets had Newport's elite entombed beneath their own foundations? The Pinkerton Connection A's. Harrison's team cataloged the grisly evidence. Another revelation emerged. Among the debris near Isabella's body lay a thin scrap of parchment bearing the watermark of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Not a letter. Not even words, just a fragment. But enough. Harrison had already heard whispers that Newport's wealthiest families employed private agents to deal with inconvenient matters. But now, here was proof. The Pinkertons had not only watched Isabella, they had carried out her execution. This discovery twisted the case into something far larger than Harrison had anticipated. He wasn't investigating a disappearance anymore. He was unraveling a conspiracy where justice itself had been rewritten as a tool of the powerful, and he wasn't sure he would survive it. The haunted city Newport changed after Isabella's body was found. Or perhaps Harrison simply began to see it differently. The grand mansions, once symbols of triumph, now looked like mausoleums, each hiding chambers filled with secrets and silences. The air on Bellevue Avenue seemed colder. Windows glimmered at night when no one was home. Servants spoke of perfumes that lingered in corridors long after rooms had been emptied. Carriage drivers swore they saw a woman in blue silk drifting through the fog, only to vanish at the turn of the road. And in the Belmont Hotel, guests who stayed in room 237 reported the same dream. A woman scratching at the walls while a muffled orchestra played somewhere above them. Newport society insisted Isabella's case was over, buried, forgotten. But the city itself seemed unwilling to let her rest. The breakthrough came not from the evidence but from the shadows. One evening, as Harrison prepared his notes, he returned to his desk to find a sealed envelope resting atop his files. No one had entered the office. No one had passed his watch. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in Isabella's unmistakable script, were 3 words, "Not the last." The pattern of vanishing Detective Harrison had seen his share of crimes: dockside stabbings, arson in the tenements, the occasional bloody feud that left bodies in alleys. But the Fairmont case was, different. Isabella was no dockside pauper, and Newport was no common city. It was a kingdom carved out of gold, where the walls of every ballroom concealed debts, secrets, and betrayals stacked higher than champagne towers. And now he understood something that made his hands tremble as he poured himself another drink. Late at night, Isabella Fairmont had not been the first. The vanishing ledger. The letter slipped onto Harrison's desk. Not the last, gnawed at him like a splinter under the skin. He began combing through police archives, yellowed clippings, even whispers scribbled in tavern ledgers. Patterns emerged. A maid in 1882, last seen delivering invitations to a mansion on Ochre Point. A banker's widow in 1883 who supposedly fled to Europe, though her steamship cabin was never boarded. A young poet in 1886, favored by society ladies until he vanished after a reading at Rosecliff. Each disappearance polite society had explained away with tidy stories. But the common thread was this: every one of them had, in some way, crossed paths with the powerful families Isabella had threatened. And when Harrison pulled the architectural records of those families' homes, his breath caught. Every one of those mansions had been improved by Jonathan Pembroke. The hidden chambers were not peculiarities, they were tombs. The survivor in late February 1890, Harrison received an anonymous note instructing him to meet at a chapel on the edge of town. The writing was shaky, the ink blotched, as if written by someone terrified. There, in the flickering candlelight, he met a woman who introduced herself only as Eliza. She had once been a housemaid at the Hartwell estate, another mansion shaped by Pembroke's hand. Her story was fragmented, whispered, choked by fear. She claimed she had been lured into one of the hidden chambers as punishment for overhearing a private conversation about forged contracts. But the lock had been faulty, and she escaped through a narrow crawlspace meant for airflow. She fled Newport and never spoke of it. until Isabella's body was discovered. What haunted her most was not the chamber itself. It was what she heard, inside. There was someone else, she whispered, clutching Harrison's sleeve. A woman's voice, scratching, crying. But when I pushed through the panel, the room was empty. Eliza swore the voices had followed her for weeks after. In the silence of night, she could still hear fingernails dragging across wood. The ghost map. Expands Harrison's obsession deepened. He began sketching a map of Newport that was unlike any drawn before. Not streets, not mansions, but hidden spaces. False walls, tunnels, vaults. When overlaid, the map looked almost deliberate, like a secret architecture beneath the city itself. The pattern unnerved him. The chambers weren't scattered randomly. They aligned along the cliffs pointing toward the sea, like a procession of stone coffins angled toward the horizon. A geometry of silence. Was this Pembroke's design, or the demand of his employers? And why did it seem less like concealment, and more like ritual? Shadows at the door. Harrison was not imagining the pressure. He returned home one night to find his door ajar, though he remembered locking it. On his desk, his case notes had been rifled through. A single calling card lay atop the papers, the emblem of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. No name, just the emblem, embossed in black. That night, as he lay in bed, he swore he heard footsteps pacing in the corridor outside his room. Slow, deliberate. When he yanked the door open, the hallway was empty, except for a faint trace of perfume, French, the same scent reported lingering in Isabella's final suite. The line between his suspects and his dead victim was blurring, as though Isabella herself was urging him onward. By March 1890, Harrison believed he had proof that Newport's hidden chambers were more than hiding places. They were graves. He prepared a report for federal authorities, his hand trembling, as he signed the final page. But before he could deliver it, a sealed envelope arrived at his office. Inside was a single photograph. Isabella Fairmont seated in a studio chair, eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. But in this photograph, different from the ones catalogued after her disappearance, her lips were parted, as if mid-sentence. And scrawled across the bottom in handwriting Harrison did not recognize were 3 words, "She told me." The whispering walls. By spring of 1890, Newport glittered as though nothing had happened. The mansions opened their shutters, orchestras rehearsed, and champagne shipments doubled as if society could drown the memory of Isabella Fairmont in bubbles and laughter. But Detective Harrison could no longer see Newport the same way. Each mansion was a skull, every ballroom a hollow cavity. He saw ghosts in every mirror, heard scratches beneath every floorboard. The photograph that arrived on his desk, the one of Isabella with lips parted mid-sentence, stared at him whenever he closed his eyes. And though he tried to dismiss it, he could swear her expression was changing. The photograph at first, he thought. Fatigue was deceiving him. One night her eyes looked downward, the next they seemed to glance at his notes. By the 3rd week, he could not deny it. The faint curve of her lips had shifted, from resignation to something like warning. He showed the photograph to a trusted colleague at the station. The man frowned. "She isn't speaking," he said. "She's listening." Harrison locked the photo in a drawer. But the sound of scratching began again, late at night from the walls of his office, as if someone wanted to be let out. The testimony. In April, Harrison was approached by Father Callahan, a priest from Trinity Church who had known Isabella since childhood. His face was pale as parchment. "There are confessions," Callahan said, lowering his voice. "Men of prominence. They spoke of sins not meant for the ear of God, but for silence. They feared exposure, and they feared her. Isabella." Callahan revealed something chilling. Isabella had visited him days before her disappearance, asking about absolution for a sin she had not yet committed. She told him she was preparing to bury the living in truth. She wept, the priest whispered. But not for herself, for Newport. The disappearing witnesses. Harrison tried to gather allies. Eliza, the maid who had escaped a chamber, vanished again. Her boarding room left untouched, her bed unslept in. Margaret Winthrop, the seamstress who had sworn she saw Isabella enter the Piton courtyard, was found dead in her home. The cause, officially recorded as accidental gas leak, it was too precise to be coincidence. The conspiracy was cleaning house. But as Harrison pressed deeper, he began to sense that even those pulling the strings were unsettled. One of Piton's own. Servants cornered him in an alley, trembling. "She walks," the man muttered. "In the corridors, blue silk, we hear her in the walls." Then he shoved a folded scrap of vellum into Harrison's hand and fled. It was another blueprint. A hidden chamber beneath the Belmont Hotel itself, the bow. Descent lantern in hand, Harrison entered the hotel's basement under cover of night. Dust swirled like breath in the narrow corridors. He followed the blueprint's marks, 3 paces from the wine racks, a hollow in the wall, and pressed. Panel shifted. Behind it lay another door, iron and seamless like the one at the Piton estate. His lantern flickered, threatening to go out. This chamber was smaller, tighter. And inside were not bones but belongings, a jeweled hair comb, a child's shoe, a man's pocket watch. Relics of the vanished. Dozens of them, and etched into the stone wall by some desperate hand was a single phrase repeated over and over until the letters blurred together. "She knows. She knows. She knows." As Harrison turned to leave, the lantern guttered out, plunging him into silence. Except it wasn't silent. From the lead-lined dark, a woman's voice whispered close to his ear, soft as breath. Not the last. The words were identical to the letter that had appeared weeks ago, but this time the voice wasn't in his mind. It was inside the chamber with him. The last waltz detective Harrison never told anyone what he heard in the dark of the Belmont chamber. If he did, he knew they would brand him unfit for duty. His career ended, his sanity in question. But the voice remained. Soft, patient, persistent. Isabella Fairmont did not fade with her burial. She grew louder, and Harrison realized too late her death had not been the conclusion. It had been the overture. The collapsing circle. By the summer of 1890, Newport's pillars began to crumble. Charles Piton, railroad magnate and master of the mansion where Isabella had perished, was found in his New York residence, hanging from a rope tied to a chandelier. The newspapers politely called it heart failure, Mom, but servants whispered they had found him babbling in the days before, claiming a woman in blue silk paced outside his bedroom door every night. Senator William Blackstone's career fell like glass dropped on marble. A cache of documents, long rumored but never proven, surfaced in Washington. Ledgers of bribes, forged contracts, even names of officials bought like common goods. Blackstone denied everything, but when federal agents raided his home, they found the documents exactly where Isabella had claimed, hidden behind the fireplace. His Senate expulsion came swiftly. His death alone in a boarding house came not long after. One by one, the names Isabella had whispered, written, or scratched into ash were consumed. Each death, each downfall, carried whispers of her hand guiding, justice from beyond. But justice was not clean. It was hungry. Harrison's revelation. Harrison compiled everything. Blueprints, testimonies, fragments of Isabella's letters, the cursed photograph. His notes read less like police files and more like scripture, a gospel of conspiracy and haunting. The more he wrote, the clearer the pattern became. Pembroke had not been a con man in the ordinary sense. He had been an architect of silence, commissioned to create vaults of disappearance. His blueprints formed a lattice across Newport, a system designed not just to hide evidence, but to contain people. And Isabella, with her defiance, had threatened to expose all of it. But what chilled Harrison most was the realization that Isabella's evidence had never been found. Not in her suite, not in the chambers, not in any safe. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And the longer he searched, the louder the scratching in his walls became. The night at Rosecliff. The climax came in September 1890. Harrison was summoned anonymously to Rosecliff Manor, Isabella's former home. The estate had been shuttered since her death, its marble halls silent, its gardens overgrown. Inside, dust lay thick across gilded furniture, as if the house had been holding its breath. In the ballroom, moonlight poured through tall windows, onto the parquet floor where Isabella had once waltzed with senators and dukes. On a table in the center of the room sat an envelope marked with her initials. Inside was a single page of her handwriting, steady and deliberate. You looked in the wrong places. I hid the truth where they would never dare to look, in their own reflections. Harrison raised his eyes to the ballroom mirrors. Dozens of them lined the walls, their surfaces warped by age. His lantern flame flickered, and in the shifting light he saw not his own face but Isabella's. Over and over in every mirror, her eyes staring back. And then the music began, a faint waltz, sourceless, threading through the empty hall. The last waltz Harrison backed toward the door, but the mirrors seemed to swell with movement. In each reflection, Isabella lifted her hand as though inviting him to dance. Her blue silk gown shimmered, her ruby brooch gleamed red as a wound. Not the last, she whispered from every wall. The mirrors shuddered, the glass rippling as though it were water. For an instant, Harrison saw more than Isabella. He saw others, faces pale, eyes hollow, the vanished men and women who had fed Newport's hunger. Their fingers pressed against the glass, begging to be remembered. And then the mirrors cracked. The sound thundered like gunfire, shards raining down. Harrison stumbled as the ballroom filled with screams. Dozens, hundreds layered atop one another, rising into a single wail of grief and fury. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Isabella herself stepping forward from the mirror. Her eyes fixed on him with an expression neither kind nor cruel but final. When servants discovered the detective's lantern the next morning, it was guttered out on the ballroom floor. Harrison himself was gone. His notes remained, scattered like a confession, but his body was never found. Some whispered he had gone mad and fled. Others said the families had silenced him as they had silenced Isabella. But among Newport's working class, another story spread, that Isabella had claimed him, that she had taken the one man who dared to listen, drawing him into her endless waltz of vengeance. Rosecliff Manor was abandoned, left to rot. The mirrors were covered with black cloth, but guests swore the sound of music still echoed at night, and that faint scratching could be heard beneath the ballroom floor. And the evidence Isabella promised? It surfaced decades later, hidden behind a loose brick in the Belmont Hotel, enough to prove every word she had spoken true. But by then, the guilty were long dead, their fortunes scattered, their names stained forever. Newport tried to forget. The mansions still gleam along the cliffs, but locals cross themselves when fog rolls in from the sea. They say a woman in blue silk still wanders Bellevue Avenue, perfume in her wake, her ruby brooch catching the moonlight. Some secrets, after all, refuse the grave, and some voices never stop whispering, not the last.